Okay, I've got the live stream up now, so I'm gonna start letting people in if that's okay. So welcome to everyone logging on. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to everyone who is watching live on Facebook and YouTube. We are just going to take a couple of minutes to let people get connected. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, what organization you're with, what your name is. We're very happy to have you here. So thank you to those of you who have started to introduce yourself in the chat. Good to have all of you here. Hopefully we'll still have some more people joining us. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the introduction. So my name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the interim executive director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And we are very excited to have Dr. Josh Edrington with us today to lead this discussion on tariffs. What are they and why they matter? And while this topic may seem a bit unusual for the Interfaith Center, and tariffs may seem like an obscure technical trade policy, they have real world impacts that directly affect the values and concerns many religious groups uphold, particularly in how they impact the poor, global justice, ethical trade, and the well being of vulnerable populations, both locally and internationally. So we are very privileged to have Dr. Edrington here with us today, who is a professor of economics at Miami University in Ohio. He's received his bachelor's in economics from Malacaster College
McAllister.
in Minnesota and earned his MS, Allister, sorry, and his MS and PhD in economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Edrington's field of research is international economics, and he works on issues such as the structure of trade agreements, the relationship between environmental legislation and international trade, and technology adoption by firms in a global economy. So with that,
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on, where is it? Because I kind of put some slides together from when I teach international trade to the undergraduates. I wound up with a lot of slides, but don't worry, we're going to skip over some of them in the process. So it should only take me about 30 or 35 minutes to get through kind of everything I wanted to say and then have, if there are any questions. And so first, kind of to understand tariffs, it kind of helps to have some context of where we currently are. And so economists think of us sort of in the third era of globalization. So the first era was sort of the Industrial Revolution, steamships and all that. The second era of globalization was after World War II. This mostly involved the higher income countries, North America, Europe, some East Asia, like Japan and Korea. And it was a lot of it was just a big explosion in trade in goods due to two things. One is the decline in transportation cost, international shipping, big containers, automated ports, all that. And the second thing is a decline in trade barriers worldwide. And one of the things you'll notice, this is average world tariffs, is, I mean, I ended it in 2000, but even then, average tariffs across the world were less than 5%. Okay, so the US has low tariffs with everybody else, and everybody else kind of has low tariffs against the US. There's some exceptions to that, but that's generally where we are. And so what we're considered to be now is the third era of globalization. The main difference is globalization, sort of the movement of goods, people, and capital across borders. The main difference in the third era was globalization kind of expanded to all of the world. Okay, so currently almost every country in the world is a member of the World Trade Organization. As getting membership implies that they reduce their barriers against everybody else. And so globalization is now kind of global. It involves all countries. Also, there's been a lot more movement of people. So foreign-born population in the US is at historical, it's maybe not historical highs, but it's approaching the levels during the Industrial Revolution that we had. And global supply chains. This is the free movement of capital. What really differentiates the third era of globalization are these global supply chains. So this is kind of what the picture is iPhone manufacturing. Apple, the way they manufacture the iPhone is they have all these components being produced in all different parts of the world, Korea, Germany, France, all these other things. And then they assemble the iPhone in China and ship it to the US, okay? What's interesting though about global supply chains is it's not just big multinational companies. It's pretty much, now down to even small and medium-sized firms within the US usually have foreign suppliers. So suppose I am a high-end boutique blue jeans manufacturer in the US. I am probably getting my denim from Japan, things like that, okay? Two other things that, this is kind of interesting. So this is sort of some good news among all this sort of stuff. The nice thing about the third era of globalization is it's a time where there is the biggest reduction in worldwide poverty, basically in the world. So this little line, orange line here is the world poverty rate, which is a couple of dollars a day. So it's much lower than the US poverty rate. What we've seen is a big convergence of incomes worldwide, but also a big decline in world poverty. So if you go back to the 1800s, most people were poor. If you go back to 1975, most people in Africa and Asia were poor, and there's been this big shift towards higher incomes worldwide, which is kind of associated with globalization. And so kind of what you can take from this is no matter what the US does, at least in the near future, the rest of the world is not going to abandon globalization. Two other things that are kind of important to know. First, if you want to know who the US trades with, it's easy to remember. It's Mexico, Canada, and China. Imports, exports, Mexico, Canada, and China. And the other thing, and so this is actually worth showing up because it's something that a lot of people don't know. When they think about trade, they often think about final consumer goods. Like you go to Walmart, you grab the good, it says made in Vietnam or made in China or whatever. Those final goods are only around 36% of what the US imports. The majority of what the US imports are inputs into US production, okay? So most of inputs, the consumer of most of what the US imports into the US are US firms that are using the inputs to produce other goods, okay? So a lot of them are things like, if you're manufacturing cars, you might be importing welding robots from Canada. If you're making motorcycles in the US, you might be importing brake pads or windshield glass from Mexico. A lot of the inputs are raw materials like rubber or soybeans or coal, all that sort of stuff. Okay. And so I'll be talking about consumers a lot when I talk about tariffs, but a lot of times the consumer is a US firm that's using the import as a production input. Okay, so that's the context. Now we can talk about tariffs. So simply, a tariff is a tax on the import of the good into the country. So it's basically when you bring the foreign good into the country, you pay the tariff. It can show up in different ways. It could be a specific tariff, like $50 per bicycle. It could be what's called an ad valorem tariff, which is a percent of the value of the bicycles. But basically, the idea is if I go to Mexico and buy 10 bikes and put them into a truck and drive them across the border, I will be stopped at the border and the customs official will say, hey, the tariff is $50 per bicycle. You have 10 bicycles. You owe me $500 to bring those goods into the US. Okay, so that's the basic idea. The tariff is a tax on imports. And so the way it works is when the good enters a US port of entry, so a lot of times these are coming on big container ships, but it could be planes, it could be cars, trucks across the border. The good is classified, it's charged a tariff rate basically based on its classification, like what is the good? Is it a motorcycle or a bicycle? And then where it's coming from. The where it's coming from is just because we have trade agreements with different countries. So we charge different tariffs to different countries. Okay. And this is very much kind of how you pay income taxes, and that importers self-classify. They basically say, I am bringing in this stuff. It's worth this much. I owe this much tariff. Here's the money. Okay. And the US customs are basically just reviewing the paperwork. They're kind of like the IRS. They're just reviewing the paperwork, occasionally auditing and collecting the money. But the key thing is that a tariff is paid by the importer of the product, which is typically a US firm. Okay, it is Walmart or whoever it is bringing goods in, or the US firm that's importing the production input into the country. And so this is just the tariff schedule. We charge different tariffs on different products, like 17% tariff on chocolate milk, 2% tariff on mineral drinks. I'm not going to go into that. Okay, so let's jump to kind of the question of who sets tariffs, because this is sort of interesting. First, tariffs are set by the federal government. Louisiana, even if the good comes into New Orleans, can't charge a tariff. Tariffs are only the federal government. Second, the power to set tariffs is given in the US Constitution to the legislative branch. So Congress has the power to set tariffs. However, since the 1930s, basically the Great Depression, they have handed over that power to the executive branch, the president. So Congress has authorized the president to negotiate trade agreements, and then Congress just comes in at the end and ratifies. And likewise, Congress has authorized the president to adjust tariff rates in response to specific things. Okay. And so this is why the Trump administration has the power to set tariffs, is because Congress has granted them that power. So you might ask, can Congress come and undo all of this? And the answer is yes, they can. Okay. But currently, this is the way they've done it, is Congress has authorized the executive branch to sort of set trade policy. This is the history of tariffs. The main thing to see in this is US tariffs prior to this current administration were historically low. Okay, they've been low for the last several decades. Typically, they average around 1.5% for a lot of goods. For a lot of countries, they're actually zero. Free trade, tariff revenue has been less than 2% for the last several decades. There are obviously exceptions, like the US has high tariffs on pickup trucks, high tariffs on sugar, things like that. The US also has higher tariffs on China ever since 2018 trade war. But for the vast majority of products, US has low tariffs, okay, until obviously the recent actions. You might ask from all this, if I travel to Canada and buy some t-shirts and bring them back into the US, do I have to pay a tariff on them? And the answer is not unless you buy a whole bunch of t-shirts. So we do have what is called a de minimis threshold, that you only have to pay tariffs if the shipment is over $800 worth. And so as long as you buy less than $800 worth of t-shirts, you don't have to pay. What's interesting actually about this is this de minimis threshold has led to a huge growth of Chinese online marketplaces. I don't know if people have heard of this, but the two famous ones are Temu and Shein. And it's because their logistics strategy is they ship directly from China to the customer. And so if you go and order a $40 dress on the Shein online app, because $40 is less than $800, you don't pay a tariff on it, or you haven't in the past. This is one of the things the administration is doing, is they've gotten rid of the de minimis threshold for Chinese shipments. But from basically 2018 to now, there's been this big increase in these sort of online marketplaces for this exact reason. Okay. So that's the nuts and bolts of a tariff. The only other thing I wanted to talk about a bit was what are the economic effects of a tariff? Like who pays the tariff, who gains from the tariff, that sort of thing. And so an easy way to remember the economics of a tariff is it's sort of a combination of a consumption tax and a production subsidy. So what a tariff is doing is it's basically a tax on US consumers of the good. The US consumers, because of the tariff, are going to pay more for the good, higher prices. It's a tax on US consumers, okay? However, goods produced in the US don't pay the tariff because they're produced in the US. And so the tariff also is a subsidy to US producers because you're basically taxing their foreign competition. And so since you're taxing the foreign competition, the US producers can charge higher prices and sell more, okay? So we can kind of take each of those in turn. And so the first question is, who pays the tariff? And one of the ways to think about this is go back to my example of the US jeans manufacturer who is importing denim from Japan. If the US imposes a tariff on it, now you have to pay more for that Japanese denim, okay? Because you have to pay to get it into the country. And so if you're the US jeans manufacturer, you could call up your supplier in Japan and say, hey, the US is taxing me a lot more, you know, to keep buying from you, I need a discount. And so it's possible you could get a discount. But this is where we can actually look and see historically, has that happened? And so what we are using here in these pictures is the US-China trade war of 2018. And so the top two pictures are basically saying, after the US imposed tariffs on China, we imported less from China, which makes sense. This is the bottom left picture is important because this says, okay, when we impose tariffs on China, did we get lower prices from China? So these are the prices in China, the little red dots. And as you can see, they do not go down. Basically, the price in China stayed the same. What happened was when we imposed tariffs on China, the price in the US went up. You can see the little red dots here. So this is the US price. This is the Chinese price. You can see that basically when you're imposing a tariff, you are taxing, if the US imposes a tariff, they're basically taxing the US, okay? The price of the good in the US goes up. And so that's why we consider it a consumption tax, is when you impose a tariff on a good, the price in the US goes up, it's a tax on US consumers. And so give you an idea of amounts, this once again is the Chinese trade war in 2018. The estimate is that basically the tariff raised $34 billion in increased US revenue. Who paid that? It was US consumers in paying higher prices for the goods. And so the estimate is around a 51 billion annual loss to US consumers. If you have 130 million households, that's 300, 400 bucks in lower income to US households because of the higher prices, okay? Not huge, but not small either. You might want to ask, well, what are the effects of the current tariffs that have been proposed. And so once again, these aren't old, this is estimates. So these aren't as sure because we're trying to project what's going to happen in the future. Okay. And so this is from the Yale Budget Lab, who's been doing yeoman work, because if you're aware, the tariffs are there's a lot of uncertainty. They're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. And so the Yale Budget Lab constantly has to be updating their numbers as everything changes. And so I believe these numbers are for the 10% tariff on everybody, the higher tariffs on China, but not the huge tariffs on China, the now reduced tariffs on China. And then we have a couple of tariffs on other things like steel and things like that. Okay. There are also the problem is they keep throwing in exemptions and stuff like that. Like they talk to Apple and suddenly they exempt electronics. And so it's hard to keep track of everything. But the latest figures I got were that it's estimated that the tariffs are going to increase prices by about 1.7%. So not giant, although it's going to be larger in things like clothing and textiles. Okay. It hasn't happened yet, but this is for the production for future. And so what does that mean? Well, for the median household in the US, the median household income is around $83,000. That's an estimated loss of around $2,300 disposable income. Okay. So the tariffs that are being posed now are much higher than the old, the US trade war. Okay. They're a lot more significant. Now you might ask, well, why don't I just stop buying goods from other countries? Why don't I just buy US goods? Okay, because they don't get charged the tariff, which you can do that. But one of the things to realize is the price of US goods is going to go up as well. Okay, for basically two reasons. One is that as consumers switch towards US goods, that increases demand for US goods, and increased demand is increased prices. It's kind of like how, if you remember during the pandemic, used cars got really expensive. Why did used cars get really expensive? Because during the pandemic, global shipping shut down, so there could be no new cars coming into the US, and US car manufacturers couldn't get the foreign inputs they needed to make new cars. And since there were no new cars, there's an increase in demand for used cars, and the price of used cars goes up. Okay. So similarly, if you tax foreign goods, that increases demand for US produced goods, but therefore the price of US produced goods was going to go up. Okay. And the other reason goes back to what I mentioned before, which is the main consumer of foreign goods is US firms themselves as part of their production process. Okay, 70% of what we import, 65% of what we import is inputs for US firms. And so these tariffs, what the tariffs do is they increase production costs for US firms. That's going to result in higher prices of US goods. So when I say the prices go up, it's actually price of everything goes up, not just foreign goods as a result of the tariff. And this gets us to the fact that tariffs are considered a regressive tax and that they affect poor households more than richer households because poorer households spend a higher percentage of their income. Okay, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're spending almost all of your paycheck. As a result, higher prices are going to affect you more than a rich household that's spending a lower percentage. And so this is an older projection, but you basically get the same pattern anytime you talk about the distributional effect of a tariff. So down here at the 10th percentile, these are rich households. So, households making $234,000 a year. The negative effect of the tariff of them is a lot smaller than the effect on the poor households, which are down here in the second decile and third decile. So these are households making more like $33,000 a year. In percentage terms, they are going to get a bigger hit than the rich households because they spend a larger percentage of their income. And you can actually see that in the de minimis exemption. So I mentioned before these online marketplaces like Shein and Temu. Who is using them? It's poorer households. So I think economists looked at this, and 48% of those de minimis packages, so the packages that are under the 800 threshold that they're getting from these online marketplaces, 48% of them were going to poorer zip codes, and only 22% were going to richer ones. And so the main people using these sort of online marketplaces like Shein and Temu are poor households, which means if you rescind the exemption, you're primarily impacting low-income households. Now you might ask, is that why economists don't like tariffs? Because economists dislike tariffs. I think we've been very clear a lot of times that we dislike tariffs. It's actually not. So the reason economists dislike tariffs is we consider them an inefficient way to raise revenue. Okay. Basically, you don't raise nearly as much money as you think you do by imposing these tariffs. And what you do a lot of times is distort decisions. Okay, so and so to give you an idea of why this is, you can take a thought experiment. Suppose you're the US government and you're like, people buy a lot of red apples. I'm going to raise a lot of money by taxing red apples. Every time you buy a pound of red apples, I'm going to charge you $5. Look at how much money I'm going to raise, because of all these people buying red apples. Okay. Well, you can see the problem is that if you impose that tax, you are not going to raise much money because people are just going to switch away from the red apples to green apples or other fruits. Okay. So you aren't going to raise much money, but in the process of not raising much money, you're going to make all these distortions of the economy. Okay. So people that prefer red apples aren't going to buy red apples. They're going to buy green apples, even though they might think they're too tart. That is distortion. Economists don't like it. It's a loss. Okay. Farmers are going to have to cut down their red apple trees because they can't sell the red apples anymore and plant something else. Once again, that's a cost. That's a loss. That's a distortion. Okay. And then companies are going to spend a lot of resources lobbying governments to have pink apples declared not red to avoid the tariff, the tax. Once again, this is a distortion. Okay. And so the problem with these sort of things, and this is the way economists think about tariffs, is it's the same thing. You don't raise much money from it. Instead, people spend a lot of, resources trying to evade it, okay, and switch their decisions, and that creates a lot of distortionary cost to it. And you can kind of see in those pictures that when I did the cost before, where is it? We're raising a $34 billion in revenue at a cost of $51 billion in losses to the consumer. There's sort of the inefficiency there. Oops, so. Okay. However, this leads to the second question, which is the production subsidy. Because one of the ways, let's take a case where the US imposes a tariff on Chinese solar panels. Okay. Well, one of the ways that consumers are going to evade that tariff is they're going to buy US solar panels instead. Okay. And so you might say, well, isn't that good for US firms? Okay. If instead of buying Chinese produced solar panels, they buy US produced solar panels, won't that help US firms? And so I actually use this because First Solar is a Ohio-based company, since I'm here in Ohio, and they're the largest US manufacturer of solar panels. And so if you put a tariff on Chinese solar panels, First Solar can charge higher prices for their solar panels and sell more solar panels because you're basically taxing their competition. Okay. And so you might ask, isn't that a good thing? And the answer is, for First Solar, it is. And so, yes, you can see they actually they lobbied for and got the US government to do this. This was during the Biden administration, imposing tariffs on both Chinese solar panels and then Asian solar panels. And as a result, their stock price went up because they could now sell more solar panels at a higher price than before. And so you can actually see that in the calculations. If you go back to my estimates of the US-China trade war, the US government gained $34 billion in revenue. Who paid that? US consumers and higher prices, $51 billion annual loss. But there's somebody who also gained from higher prices, and that was US producers, because of the shift in demand away from foreign goods to US goods, okay? And so they gained 10 billion. And so when you add it all up, you get about a 7.2 billion aggregate loss to raise 34 billion, okay? So, but you can kind of see the effects of the tariff. It's paid for by consumers. It raises money for the government. US producers don't always lose. Sometimes they gain. And as economists say, though, it's inefficient. And this is the important part that I kind of want to stress before I open it up to questions, which is when I say that US production increases, I mean US production in that product. Okay. So if we impose a tariff on foreign solar panels in the US, we will produce more solar panels. We will not produce more in aggregate. And therefore, this is important because it means if we produce more solar panels, we're producing less of something else, okay? Because aggregate production is going to be roughly constant, okay? And what that means is what tariffs do is they affect what you produce. They don't affect the aggregate amount produced in the US. This is something economists have been arguing for literally hundreds of years. You can actually see, if you want to, you can Google this. It's French economist Frédéric Bastiat, his Candlemakers Petition. He wrote it in 1845. If you read it, though, you'll see, hey, seems awfully familiar because it's the same sort of arguments we've been talking about for the last 100 years, which is proponents of tariffs have been arguing for over basically 200, 300 years, 200 years, I guess, that tariffs will increase the aggregate amount produced in the US. And economists say, no, it won't. It will increase the you produce of some goods and decrease the amount you produce in other goods. It just changes what you produce, okay? And kind of the reason economists think of this, the way our models work is, you have all these firms and consumers, and they're all doing the best they can, maximizing relative constraints. And so it's kind of like a filled, air mattress with air. A tariff is just pushing down part of the air mattress and another part pops up. It's not increasing the amount of air in the air mattress, it's just relocating the air, okay? And so this is why if you look at economists, when they estimate the effects of the tariff, and so this is from the Budget Lab again, estimating the effects of the recent tariffs by the Trump administration, what you see is production in some sectors, in some industries goes up, and production in other sectors goes down. Okay, it's not increasing, the tariffs aren't increasing the amount produced in the US, they're just changing what is produced in the US, okay? And that's not to say that that's an unimportant question, okay? Because you might wonder what trade economists do with all their time. We just sit around and talk about how wonderful trade is. It's actually very important what you produce, okay? This is where the gains to trade come from is specialization. Instead of everyone, the US producing a little bit of every good, it actually makes more sense and more efficient if we specialize in aircrafts and some other countries specializes in toys and another country specializes in soybeans, and we can trade with each other then, okay? Instead of producing everything, I produce a lot of one good and trade for what I need. There are all these economic models talking about how efficient this is. But there are also a lot of economic models talking about how this might impact the distribution of income. And so might make some people better off. Because if you can imagine trade increasing production of some goods and decreasing production of others, if you're in the industry that's going down, you might be worse off. And so you can see this was actually a famous economic study that was looking at the impact on the US economy of imports from China. And this is sort of a heat map where red areas basically are producing goods that are going down, and the yellow and blue areas and the green areas are producing goods that aren't, okay? And what the paper showed is that the areas in red wound up a lot worse off than the other areas. And so they find what we call the trade exposed regions saw a decline in manufacturing employment, a decline in employment, a decline in wages, and an increased reliance on government transfers, okay? A lot of times this has been interpreted as, oh, the US lost from importing from China, which is not actually the idea of the paper. The idea of the paper is it affects the distribution. Basically, it was showing that the people living in these red areas lost relative to the rest of the US. Okay, and so this is one of the things that you're going to have with the tariffs is, what economists think are going to have from the tariffs is we know that they're going to result in people consuming less. It's a tax on consumption. Prices are going to be higher. People will consume less. but it will also have this distributional effects, okay? That some people are going to be worse off, but some people actually might benefit, okay? Oh, why not? Yes, I almost forgot. One final thing, so then I'm done. Which is you might think, oh, if all tariffs are doing is increasing certain sectors and decreasing others, why did the stock market collapse when they announced the tariffs? So this was Liberation Day, where the Trump administration announced large tariffs on every country, and the stock market tanked. Okay, and so you might think, well, why did it tank? You know, shouldn't it be that the stock price of some firms went up and the stock price of other firms went down? Okay, the reason it tanked once again goes, my assumption goes back to the idea that so much of what the US imports is production inputs. And, this is a global supply chain thing. And therefore, these large tariffs were seen as significantly increasing the cost of production in the US because you're basically you're taxing all these US firms because they're the main consumers of these foreign inputs. And you can even see that, I talked before about First Solar and how it had lobbied for tariffs previously. But once you face tariffs on every product and high tariffs on some, their stock plunged as well because they are also a global company. Okay, it's hard for these companies in this sort of global supply chain marketplace to completely immune from foreign production. And so that is pretty much I could talk a bit about more about what has actually been proposed from the Trump administration tariff standpoint. But those are very uncertain, so I thought I'd stop here and open up to questions. And so I can stop sharing.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or write them in the chat. No, no one has any questions. Everyone is a tariffs expert now.
If people wanted to, I don't know if there's a demand for this or because I know I went on for like 30 minutes about this 35 minutes. But I could talk about the current a little more. This is more of the controversial stuff about what is the Trump administration plans and stuff like that. But
yeah, I think that would be helpful. There are a few comments coming in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I see one question about have past tariffs been targeted only? Okay. So if you in the last 50 years, yes. For the last 50 years, tariffs have been a lot more targeted. You're actually allowed, even though the US has a web of trade agreements with other countries, the trade agreements provide a lot of flexibility to increase tariffs to protect certain domestic manufacturing industries. But usually it's for specific cases. And so in the past, they've been very targeted, like, okay, let's raise tariffs to protect US manufacturing and the car industry. And so we raised tariffs on US cars or, solar panels or stuff like that. For the past, this is definitely new. If you go back 100 years, tariffs were a lot more broad, but the broad base, the fact that these tariffs are covering so many industries and are so large is definitely new. And the clothing and textile thing. Oh yeah, so the reason it's clothing and textile, the reason those prices are going to go up so much is the US really doesn't have much so much of what we import is in clothing and textiles. There's not much of a US industry left. And so there really isn't much in the way of things to substitute away from. And so that's usually why the estimates are so high for clothing and textiles, is almost all the clothing we consume is typically it's made overseas. So there are no US substitutes. And then what are the economists who have Trump's ear telling him that convinced him it was a good idea? Okay, so this is where it kind of gets controversial. So this is kind of what I was going to talk about. Here, I'll share my screen again. Okay. Yeah, because, and this is a question that I have a lot of students ask, which is kind of like, why is the Trump administration doing this? Why are we doing this? Why are we imposing these tariffs? And it's a difficult question to answer. And so actually one of the things that's been talked about lately, because when they proposed the tariffs, everyone said, oh, price is going to go up, and this, the stock market was crashing. And so everyone's like, why are they doing this? And usually the mantra they've talked about lately is there are going to be these short run adjustment costs, but they're going to be long run benefits. So it's going to be worth it in the long run. Okay. And so the key question is, as you say, you kind of want to know is what are these long run benefits? What's the end goal? Like, what is the goal they're trying to achieve? And here's a little hint, which you might find funny, which is no one knows what they're talking about. And you can kind of, because sometimes when I'm driving to school, I listen to NPR, and NPR will have someone on to talk about the tariffs. And it sometimes entertains me because they can seriously talk for 5 minutes about the short run cost and the long run benefits without really saying what the long run benefits are. Okay. What are these, where are they going with these tariffs? And so for this talk, so a lot of times when the students ask me, I just wave my hands and say, I don't know. What the goal is of this. You can kind of, whenever they introduce tariffs, though, they usually put out a little paper, because they have to justify why they're doing the tariffs, because the president can only impose tariffs if they give a reason like national emergency, okay, or national security. And so when they issue these tariffs, they usually put something out about how this is a national emergency. And you can sometimes get a hint of what they're looking to do, the long run goals, in reading these things. And so I kind of went through them, and they mentioned 4 main things. So one is increasing manufacturing in the US. And so the idea, once again, if something goes up, something else goes down. So the argument is, hey, let's increase manufacturing and reduce our reliance on other industries like construction, like do less construction services, all these other things. And so that's sort of reversing globalization, because what you've seen over the last 50 years isn't so much a decline in manufacturing production in the US, but a huge decline in manufacturing employment in the US. Basically, most of the manufacturing facilities in the US, the US is still the 2nd largest manufacturing economy in the world, behind China, but we don't employ that many people in manufacturing because we've automated everything. I think, it's probably very true. People talk about the manufacturing worker in the US has been hit both by foreign competition of low wage jobs overseas, but also by robot competition in the US. Okay. And so when you talk about, we don't employ nearly as many people in the manufacturing sector as we used to. And so one of their goals is, hey, let's employ more people in manufacturing. This is one of the things that it's clear that they talk about manufacturing, but they don't say, our goal is to increase employment, or is it just increase manufacturing? Like bring back manufacturing, but make it all automated. Who knows? The second is sort of the opposite. Instead of reversing globalization, we're going to accelerate globalization. We're going to use the tariffs as sort of a leverage to get other countries to eliminate their non-tariff barriers. So remember, most countries in the rest of the world have low tariffs against the US. So a lot of times when we complain about not being able to export to other markets, what we're complaining about usually is non-tariff barriers. They have different regulatory standards. Okay, like we can't export our beef to Europe because they have safety standards that says you can't treat your cattle with hormones. And a lot of times in the US, we do treat our cattle with hormones, and so they ban our beef. And so a lot of times when we're talking about opening up other countries, it becomes questions about harmonizing our regulations, standardizing regulations somehow. And so, this is actually, it's sort of interesting because this is saying that centrist Democrats Clinton, I remember talking a lot about in the 90s, is globalization on steroids. And everyone at the time hated these ideas because, but this is one of the things, stated goals is mentioned. Another stated goal is to undo trade imbalances. And so this is reducing US deficits, and US deficits are primarily because the US is very reliant on foreign investment and foreign investors. So our domestic savings is low. And so to finance for a lot of investment in the US, because we have a lot of investment to do, we rely heavily on foreign investors. And so the argument is, hey, let's force more US investment to be financed through domestic savings, US savings. And finally is raising the government revenue, reducing income taxes, and replacing it with increased revenue from tariffs. Okay. Now, what's kind of hard to know, like first, it's hard to know which of these is sort of the main thing, because some of them are contradictory. Okay, there's a big difference. I have is, if you look at them, none of these stated goals sounds that great. Especially if you care about the income distribution in poor households in the US, 3 and 4 sound pretty bad. They are definitely going to be basically taxing poor households more. Even, 1 and 2, there are going to be different people who gain from these things, but who gains is going to be very different between 1 and 2. Okay, so there's always, for all these things, it's not necessarily that, there's going to be these long-run benefits. The one thing we would know about them is almost all of these things, the US will consume less because prices will be higher. And then there's going to be distributional things that some people are getting, some people lose. Without knowing which of these is the main goal, we don't know who will win and who will lose. And a lot of them seem to be regressive, and that they're going to make poorer households worse off. And then the final thing is it's hard to figure out which of these is the actual goal, because what the policies they're following don't really fit any of them. There's way too much uncertainty to actually be looking like it's trying to revitalize US manufacturing, because for that, you don't want such certainty. There's not really that much of a push. These trade deals they're signing aren't really trade agreements, because those have to be ratified by Congress. They're kind of memorandum of understanding. They don't really have legal force. And as I mentioned before, it's trade revenue or tariff revenue isn't really going to be large enough to really have a big impact on the budget. And so this is a long-winded way of kind of saying, I'm not sure what the goal of the policy is. And this is why I have trouble, explaining to the students is it's not clear from looking at what's being done, what this long-run goal actually is.
Seems like there's a lot
Okay.
on the chat, so I don't know if you're following it.
Yeah. Yeah, so the thing about the difference between the short run and long run. So the one thing, I don't think there are long run benefits of these trade policies, but it definitely is the case that the short run cost, I think they're both, it's going to be bad in the short run, it's going to be bad in the long run, but it's definitely the case is it won't be as bad in the long run, because in the long run, firms and consumers will have time to adjust. And that's the thing about market economies is they're very resilient. Like, the future is going to be different. But if you have enough time, you can kind of adjust to try to minimize the effects. And so, yeah, we'll consume less. But the other thing to remember is trade is only about 30% of the US economy. And so it won't be, so yeah, usually when you do these, the long run benefits aren't as bad. The long run costs aren't as bad. Would you please explain what are the unintended consequences of using tariffs as a political tool? And seems like the actual goal is to consolidate power. Okay, so the politics of tariffs. This is hard to get into because, there is a degree to which, because I mentioned this before, that a lot of what the US imports to the country are production inputs for firms. Okay, US firms need these foreign inputs to do their own production. And so that's just sort of where the politics come in. Because a lot of times in other countries, especially if you have more autocratic governments or more corrupt governments, they use trade policy a lot because it sort of gives them a way to choose winners and losers. Okay, politically connected firms get the tariff exemptions, non-politically connected firms don't. And so that makes, a lot of the firms or political groups in the country more beholden to the government. Yes, that is a possibility as what is, what we might, one of the other, possibilities is that they're going to use the tariff policy as, this, what you would show up a lot is tariff exemptions. There is usually a process where you can hand out tariff exemptions to firms, not to firms, but for very disaggregate goods classifications. But once again, this is trying to predict the future here, as far as what the long run goals are, which is difficult to do. Are there any other questions? Oh, and actually, there's a little interesting thing about that with the politics of it, because I saw this, but I'm trying to remember what the journal was. But basically, for the first US-China trade war, they actually did a specific tariff exemption process because, once again, a lot of what we input for China is inputs into the US production processes. And so they put up a tariff exemption process by which firms could apply to the US government to be exempted from the Chinese tariffs. Basically, what you would ask for is the very disaggregated good classification to not be charged the tariff. Okay. And what happened was they put in these, and you as a US firm would apply for it. You'd say, oh, this is the input that I'm bringing in. I can't find it anywhere in the US. You have a little, you would justify, oh, I can't find anywhere in the US. And so please, remove the tariff on it. And it kind of disappeared. And then they would come back a couple of months later and announce who got the exemptions and who didn't. And so there's a couple of, actually, they're finance researchers. I'm pretty sure it's a journal of, one of the finance journals. But because they had the firm data, they could go back and look to see if those firms tended to give to Republicans or Democrats. And so this will probably not surprise anyone here that the Republican connected firms were more likely to get the exemptions than the Democrat connected firms. Okay. And so this is one of the things, this is why trade policy, there are usually a whole bunch of trade economists who do political economics as well, because there is a tendency for who gets the tariff, who doesn't get the tariff, who gets the exemption, who doesn't get the exemption, to be very connected to the politics of the situation.
Do we have any additional questions? Not seeing any more hands or comments. I do see someone said that they will invite others to watch the YouTube. Yes, if anyone, I don't know if everyone saw that I put the link in the chat. I will send it again now. So the program was recorded. Please feel free to share the link with anyone you feel would be interested. And I'm not seeing any other questions. Last call, if anyone has any more questions or comments for Dr. Edrington. No? Okay, well, we're about right on the hour, so that is perfect. I want to be mindful of everyone's time anyway. So, um, thank you so much, Dr. Hinton, for this wonderful presentation and discussion, and thank you to everyone who participated today. This was really great. And I guess I don't know if you're willing, if anyone has questions in the future, if they can reach out to you, or if there's a way they can get in touch with you, or if you have recommendations for how people might be able to learn more.
Yeah, they could reach out. Uh, I guess I should give a shout out if you to the it's pretty easy if you Google it. It's the Yale Budget Lab, because they're the ones that I was kind of using because I mean, as you probably know, the tariffs are changing constantly. Um, and but they are so quick. So they have a model that they're just plugging the numbers into because they seriously can a lot of times it's like a couple of days after the latest announcement, they'll update it. And so that would be one way to kind of keep track of what's going on. But yeah, so and also if you Google my name, you'll see me and you can see my email address there as well. Uh,
I think I found the link. Sorry, I think my is
uh,
that okay? Can you hear me?
yes,
Okay, sorry about that. I think my internet is it's a little spotty, but I think I put the correct link in the chat for the
yes,
Yale
that looks
budget.
right.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you again for your presentation. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are in the world.